Smiles all around as Brexit talks produce a last-minute deal, a breakthrough of diplomacy, or a hurried deal to prevent the collapse of talks. And where does it leave stage 2 of negotiations? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Now, it's a breakthrough on Brexit at long last, they say. After months of bickering across the English Channel, Britain's divorce from the European Union is a major step closer. Leaders beat Friday's deadline and shook hands on the terms of the divorce agreement. Talks had stalled over how many billions Britain needs to pay to go it alone, reciprocal residency rights, and the border between the north and south of Ireland. Now, trade talks can begin, and yet more arguments seem certain. We'll bring in our guests in a moment, but first, Niamh Barker reports.
As dawn broke in Brussels, it brought with it a breakthrough on Brexit. British Prime Minister Theresa May and Brexit Secretary David Davis negotiated through the night to finalise the beginning of the divorce deal with the EU.
The Commission has just formally decided to recommend to the European Council that sufficient progress has now been made on the strict terms of the divorce.
Getting to this point has required give and take on both sides.
Friday was the last possible day for a deal to be done, so the European Council could prepare and then vote next week. Both sides admitted they made last-minute compromises to meet the deadline.
We've been working extremely hard this week, and as you've all seen, it hasn't been easy for either side.
Their meeting on Monday ended in deadlock. The sticking point was what will become of the only land border between them, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which is in the EU. The Republic wanted guarantees it will remain open, with no return to a so-called hard border with border guards. The government coalition partners in Northern Ireland, the Democratic Unionist Party, vetoed an earlier version of the deal and forced her back to the drawing board. The result?
In Northern Ireland, we will guarantee there will be no hard border, and we will uphold the Belfast Agreement. And in doing so, we will continue to preserve the constitutional and economic integrity of the United Kingdom.
Even though it's only stage 1 of negotiations, EU citizens living in Britain and British citizens residing in Europe did get some certainty about their future.
The deal we've struck will guarantee the rights of more than 3 million EU citizens living in the UK and of 1 million UK citizens living in the EU. They will be able to go on living their lives as before.
It's been 8 months since May signed Article 50, which triggered Britain's departure from the European Union. 15 months remain to decide the details of the divorce.
I will always be sad about this development. But now we must start looking for the future. A future in which the United Kingdom will be and will remain a close friend and ally.
Talks now enter the second phase, to focus on trade and security. With many jobs potentially at risk, people on both sides of the English Channel are hoping the breakup is amicable. Niamh Barker, Al Jazeera, London.
Well, let's bring our panel into the show then. We have joining us from London, the chairman of the Labour Party's Leave campaign, John Mills. From Rome, Nina Schick, an associate director at Hanbury Strategy. And for the Irish perspective, we have former Irish Cabinet Minister Conor Lenihan, who joins us today from Cambridge in the UK. Good to have you all with us. If I could start with Conor. So, this is a breakthrough that means that doomsday scenario, Conor, that we've all been worrying about, well, it now doesn't look very likely. Would you agree with that sort of statement?
Absolutely. I think what's happened today is genuinely historic. It means that the uncertainty that would have been caused by Britain crashing out of the European Union next March without any kind of agreement in place, that would have been very damaging to Ireland, and indeed the relationships that have grown up between London and Dublin over the last 20 years. Next year we mark the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, a breakthrough agreement that provided peace and stability on the island of Ireland and also in the relationships between Dublin and London. So it is good news, and hopefully time and space will be available now for the British government to negotiate a free trade deal with the European Union. If in fact there is a free trade agreement between the European Union and Britain, then there will be no problems or issues around the border area between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland.
All right, so there, let me take that positive sentiment to Nina. It's all looking rosy right now. No need for us to be worried about anything. Are we being a little too optimistic if we look at the joint report in that way?
We are certainly being optimistic because there's still a very long way to go. Let's not forget that this is just phase one of the negotiations. That's the divorce. A lot of time has been wasted. It's taken very, very, very long to come to this agreement. And the only reason it's coming to this agreement is because the UK has basically capitulated entirely to the EU position. Very, very different from what Theresa May laid out in her Lancaster House speech in January to where the UK is now on citizens' rights, on money, and obviously on the very contentious issue of Ireland and the border. Both the EU and the UK want to avoid any kind of hard border. But what has been done with the formulation today is that the issue has kind of been fudged. And this is an issue that will come up again in the future when we talk about future trading relations. And let's not forget that now we're on to phase two, the future trading relations. That's when things are going to get really difficult. As the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, admitted this week, the cabinet itself has no idea where they want to end up. So it's all well and good to say we want a free trade agreement. Okay, but let's dig down into the details. What does that actually mean? And from the EU side, it's fairly clear there's something in like the CETA offer, which is the free trade deal that the EU has with Canada, which is very, very much less than what the UK has now. So there's a lot more difficult negotiations ahead, and I think there's still scope for these talks to break down because I think domestically in the UK, politics is very tricky.
All right, there is a lot to discuss there. Let's break it down one by one, shall we, and bring John Mills into the discussion. John, let's start with Ireland, one of the most important issues. Now, this joint report says, sort of in the worst case scenario, the UK will maintain full alignment with elements of the EU single market and customs union mentioned in the Good Friday Agreement. Break that down into English. What sort of border does that mean?
Well, I think if that goes ahead, the border would be more or less non-existent. Obviously, there would be a border, but there wouldn't be customs officers there. It would be a kind of frictionless situation. I think the problem about the Irish...
Well, what does frictionless mean? I mean, let's really try and you know, get into some of these terms that are being thrown around, can we, John?
Well, let's do two sides of it. First of all, there's around people, and second, around goods. Around people, really, there isn't a problem because you can move around Europe all over the place as a tourist or on business. There are going to be restrictions on employment and on claims on social security and so on. But I mean, these are relatively easy to overcome. The more tricky bit is what to do about goods. And first of all, I don't think you need to have, even if there was no deal at all and a hard Brexit, I don't think you still need to have border guards. You can deal with virtually all of trade by pre-clearance, by the AEO system, by having trusted traders. So I think there are electronic ways of overcoming that problem. But that doesn't deal with the other issue, which is around what this being in the single market or being in line with the single market could entail. Because the single market doesn't just involve making sure that if you sell goods to Europe, they comply with safety requirements and so on. It also involves a lot of other things like what social conditions there are in the countries involved, what happens with a 48-hour week, all this sort of thing. And I think that's really where the contentious issues are going to boil up over the coming period.
All right, Nina, I could see you were shaking your head in disagreement. We do like a difference of opinion on this show, so let me give you an opportunity to come back in on this one.
Well, I think that the entire Irish issue has been very much neglected by Westminster politicians, and I think it is emblematic of Westminster navel-gazing, which has been very much a dominant feature of the Brexit debate in the UK. And when this came up as an issue, you know, many commentators in Westminster were surprised, and they saw this as an act of EU aggression and Irish aggression, when that is not the case at all. In fact, Brexit imposes a potentially devastating blow on Ireland, both economically, politically and socially, and it's not something that Ireland wanted. This was something done unto Ireland. So there is no clear solution yet. As I already mentioned, the wording around regulatory alignment that has allowed the talks to progress to stage 2 is still a fudge. So it's not good enough when Brexiteers always say, well, technology will sort out the border issue. What does that actually mean in concrete terms? And we don't know yet. And I imagine that, again, this issue will come to the fore once we go into phase 2 of negotiations. And I think it's unfair that, you know, Ireland has somehow been maligned as trying to hold up the Brexit talks when that's really not the case.
We'll talk about Ireland. Let's go to our guest, Conor. You know, that sentence which I just read out there about full alignment with elements of the EU single market and customs union between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Put that one, you know, in your mind for a second, then scroll down to the part of the joint report which has another sentence that says there'll be no new regulatory barriers between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. Now, if you put those two together, I mean, is there not, doesn't this mean that basically if Northern Ireland is in the single market and the customs union, then by default, the rest of the UK must be in too if there's no barrier between Northern Ireland or any kind of difference between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK?
Well, your analysis is correct and spot on, and the devil will be in the detail with regard to that.
But that's going to be a huge problem for Brexiteers, wouldn't it be,
having
Conor?
listened.
I mean, aren't people worried on both sides of the aisle about that?
Well, I think the key point here is I was listening to Michael Gove on the radio this morning, and it's very clear now that the British government has opted for a softer form of exit from the EU than was envisaged, for instance, last week, or was being spoken about in previous weeks in the debate around the terms of Britain leaving the European Union. So I'm presuming now, on the basis of the statement made with regard to Ireland, that there will also be a relatively friction-free, barrier-free exit by and relationship for Britain with the rest of the EU, because clearly Michael Gove is talking about a free trade agreement. Well, a free trade agreement is effectively the customs union in everything but name, and that may address some of the British concerns as well. So I suspect this is good news, because we won't have a very damaging period of adjustment. We're going to have a 2-year potentially interim agreement that allows people to smoke out the various issues of difficulty over a 2-year period before finally wrapping up the full trade agreement between and the relationship between the EU and Britain as it goes forward. So I'd be quite confident. I think the biggest barrier to or difficulty that's facing anybody in these negotiations in the next few years is the political stability issue at Westminster. Of course, Mrs. May famously said she's strong and stable before she called the election, but the election didn't result in stability at all, and there isn't stability on the Tory backbenches about European issues. So there may be difficulties along the road, but I think British business is looking for barrier-free access to the European market. It's an important market for Britain, as it is the British market is for Ireland. So I think everybody is focused on friction-free borders these days.
Everyone's focused on friction-free, and a lot of people have that confidence you're talking about, Conor, but are they all on the same page? Do they all have confidence about the same reading? The DUP leader, for example, Arlene Foster, says the agreement gives very clear confirmation that the entirety of the United Kingdom is leaving the European Union, leaving the single market and leaving the customs union. Now compare that to Ireland's Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, says, we have achieved all we've set out to achieve in phase 1. This is not the end, but it is the beginning. Is the end of the beginning, rather. The Good Friday Agreement is fully protected and the common travel area will continue. The UK is committed to avoiding a hard border. Whereas the President of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, says we still have a lot of work to do. The joint report is not the withdrawal agreement. I think that's maybe the only thing everyone can agree on is there is still some work to do. But John Mills, can there be, I mean, reading this joint report, again, you got to wonder whether there can be no hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, but at the same time, the UK completely ends freedom of movement between the EU and the UK as a whole.
Well, I think there is an element of fudge about all this to get us moving on to the discussions on trade. And I think it's going to be difficult to finalise what arrangements are going to be in place until we know what the trade deal is going to be. Is it possible to square all these various differences? The answer is I think it'll be difficult, but I don't think it's impossible to do this. I mean, I do think we want to pray and aid whatever we can do with technology to make the issues around the border as simple as possible. We need to avoid moving away from combined or equivalent regulation if we can avoid doing so. I mean, I think a lot of this is really in the end going to depend on goodwill and common sense and the extent to which people are really prepared to look for solutions that are going to be workable. And
we'll talk about goodwill and common sense.
We have had over the
what is meant when they said there that the rights of EU and UK citizens in each other's territories have been guaranteed, I think was the euphemism of the word used. Is that also left to interpretation based on goodwill and common sense?
No, I think that there's been substantial agreement about what should be done. As always with these things, there's always a little bit of uncertainty around the edges, and there's been a compromise over where the European Court of Justice should get entailed. But I mean, substantially, the rights of abode of citizens both in the UK from the EU and the other way around have been guaranteed, and I think that's a very good step forward in the right direction. I think it's quite easy in all this to multiply or magnify difficulties unnecessarily, but there's enough difficulties as it is without making some of the ones which actually are relatively easily soluble look like mountains to be climbed. Mm-hmm. And I think actually over the last few days with the discussions that have been going on, quite a lot of the difficulties have been surmounted, but I don't think that it's going to be plain sailing over the next month. There are lots more problems that are going to have to be confronted. And I hope at the end of the day we are going to reach a solution which provides as much free trade as possible between the UK and the EU 27. I think that's what everybody wants. And it's going to require some flexibility and compromise on both sides.
Flexibility and compromise. I wonder, Conor, though, if we just go over some of the headlines of what we've been talking about now, full alignment seems to be one issue that the UK has agreed to, full alignment with EU single market and customs union policies. The European Court of Justice, which John was mentioning a moment ago, they're going to have oversight over EU citizens' affairs or in some shape or form for the next 8 years after Brexit. When you put all of that together, I mean, does Nina have a point when she says this is basically the UK capitulating, or Theresa May capitulating to the EU, rather than what John was describing as both sides making that compromise deal?
Well, I think it is a compromise on Britain's part, but one of the big issues for the European side in terms of the negotiations to date has been the divisions within the British cabinet itself. I think the Financial Times ran an article a few months ago, 2 months ago or so, where it was said that there were 4 different positions and views about the potential outcome of these negotiations. And that's only talking about the British cabinet as opposed to the British Parliament and the wider Tory backbenches. So there has been a significant issue in these discussions to date that has delayed them precisely because of that political division or difference of opinion within the British cabinet itself. It seems clear to me now that Mrs May has taken her courage in her hands and put forward a compromise, and that compromise has indeed worked as far as our negotiations with the EU are concerned, that we can now cross over to a point where we can be talking about what I would say is the substantial issue, which is the trading relationship and indeed, of course, the political relationship and legal, of course, as well, that will exist between the two entities, UK on the one hand,
it may
EU
have worked,
on the other hand,
Conor, between Theresa May and the EU. Isn't there a big question here? Let me take that to Nina about whether this is going to work within the cabinet. I mean, when you start looking at all of these things I mentioned, you know, the whole point of Brexit for Brexiteers were things like Britain being completely free of EU regulations moving forward, completely ending freedom of movement, not sending any more money to the EU. I think if you add up what we do know, at least on this agreement, there's going to be money going to the EU for decades. Is there going to come a point where Brexiteers are going to stop and say, wait, hang on, what was the whole point of this?
Absolutely, and this is why I think that, you know, the talks are going to get very more emotional and fraught going forward. And that's because the idealistic utopia promised by Brexiteers outside of the EU, well, it turns out that doesn't exist, you know. So, for example, the whole fracas around the Brexit bill, it seemed to come as a huge shock to many in the UK. But now what's happened, that's been settled and we're moving on. The whole thing, you hit the nail right on the head when you mentioned the issue about regulatory alignment. Of course, from the EU's perspective, there's no such thing as seamless trade without following the rules. And now, in the compromise, basically because Northern Ireland was to be given special status, but the DUP didn't want an economic border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. So now the UK is saying Northern Ireland will be regulatorily aligned to the rest of the UK, and that will also be regulatorily aligned to the EU. So this brings us to a very uncomfortable position. And I think the question is not what is economically sound, because economically and for businesses, they want continuity, they want to be in the single market ideally, but the political reality is very different. And I think that if there comes a stage where Brexiteers feel like they've been sold down the river, by Theresa May, who's not a particularly strong or popular prime minister, then I think they might move to oust her. And that's when I think the no-deal Brexit situation becomes a viable possibility again. And I think that it is something that really is still a possibility, because these negotiations, as mentioned, we're just getting to the difficult part.
Well,
the cabinet itself
if it was
can't
about
agree
what businesses wanted,
future relationship,
probably there wouldn't have been
we're supposed to
a
be there
Brexit in the first place, right? So, but anyway, those are some good points. And I'm wondering, John Mills, another way of looking at this perhaps, is this exactly what the EU wants in terms of the bigger goal of not making Brexit look at all desirable to anybody else in the bloc?
Well, I think the EU's got to be very careful about this. I mean, I understand where they're coming from, but if they push the British too hard, then there is a danger still that we're going to finish up with a breakdown in these negotiations and no deal. And this would be very damaging from to the EU as well as to the UK, potentially. But I think the damage would probably be greater to the EU, partly because they have this huge balance of payments surplus with the British economy. So I think that one of the things that is going to be required over the coming period is for the EU to be careful not to be too demanding and to be willing to compromise and to see the things from the British point of view at least to some reasonable extent. Because I think if they don't, I think there's a huge desire in the UK to reach an agreement and to have a viable way ahead for the next 50 years. What I don't think the British people are prepared to do is to accept any terms, however bad, to achieve that. And I think the European Union needs to realise that that's the case.
Nina, we've got 1 minute. I wonder if I can get you to weigh on that leaving without a deal would be perhaps worse for the EU.
Look, Brexit it's basically a damage control exercise. So no deal Brexit is good for nobody. But the idea that somehow it'd be more damaging to the EU than the UK is ridiculous. And the case is often made to me. You know, we buy so much more from the EU. And I'm German. I talk to German car manufacturers. For them, what's far more important economically, strategically, and in the long term is protecting the single market. So if the UK wants some kind of deal where they don't abide by the rules of the single market, then they can't have that, unfortunately, because the single market is more important to the Europeans. And even though no deal Brexit would be bad for the EU, it would be a lot worse for the UK.
We are out of time for this show, but I'm sure we'll be back to talk about it again in the not too distant future, since the Brexit process isn't going away anytime soon. Let's thank our guests for now then. John Mills in London, Nina Schick in Rome, and Conor Lenihan in Cambridge. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, or for further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here now, it's goodbye.